picture a small town in West Virginia where two rivers fold into each other like hands at rest. Before we go any further into this story, if you want a brand new American mystery every single night, subscribe. One tap and a new story is waiting for you every evening. The town is Point Pleasant, and it sits on a narrow shelf of land where the Ohio River meets the Kanawha. On most evenings, the water moves slow and dark, the color of strong tea. You can stand on the bank and watch the current carry leaves south toward the bigger rivers beyond. The streets here run flat and quiet. Old brick storefronts line Main Street, their windows full of warm yellow light when the sun goes down. The roofs are tin in some places, slate in others, and the chimneys lean a little, the way old chimneys do. In the fall, the maples along the river turn the color of rust and butter, and the wind smells like wet stone and burning leaves. Beyond the edge of town, the land changes. The pavement gives up, and the woods take over. Tall sycamores stand pale against the dusk, their trunks white as bone. Beech trees hold their dead leaves all winter long, rattling like paper in the cold. Out past the last streetlight, the road narrows and curves, and the dark presses in close on both sides. That dark is where this story begins. Point Pleasant has the kind of history that gathers in layers, like silt on the bottom of a slow river. There were Shawnee villages here long before the town had a name. There was a battle here in 1774, before there was a country called America. When frontier soldiers and Shawnee warriors met in the trees and bled into the same ground. There was a powder plant during the Second World War, built deep in the woods north of town, where workers handled enough explosive to flatten a city. By the time our story starts, that plant was mostly empty, just rows of concrete domes sitting silent in the brush. The town itself was small, about 6,000 souls. Farmers, factory workers, rivermen, mothers who hung their wash on lines in the backyard and listened for the train. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's car by the sound of its engine. The kind of place where strangers got noticed before they made it down the block. And then, for 13 months between the autumn of 1966 and the winter of 1967, something happened in Point Pleasant that nobody has ever fully explained. People started seeing a thing, a tall thing, gray as wet ash, they said, shaped like a man but wrong somehow, with shoulders that hunched forward and wings that folded against its back like a great cloak. The eyes, they all agreed on the eyes, red as stoplights, red as the inside of a coal stove, eyes that glowed in the dark without any light source to explain them. They saw it in the woods. They saw it on the road. They saw it standing in the doorways of abandoned buildings, and they saw it gliding above their cars on stretches of empty highway. They saw it in pairs and in groups, husbands and wives together, teenagers parked along the river, farmers walking out to check the chicken coop at dusk. They came to the sheriff. They came to the newspaper. They told their stories with the same quiet certainty people use when they describe something they wish they had not seen. By the time it was over, more than 100 people had reported sightings. A reporter gave the thing a name that stuck. A national writer came to town with a notebook and a head full of strange ideas. A bridge fell into the river on a cold December evening, and 46 people went with it. And the question that nobody could answer, the question that hangs over Point Pleasant to this day, is what, exactly, the town had been seeing all those months before. Was it a creature? Some forgotten thing pushed out of the old powder plant when the army left? Was it a bird? A sandhill crane lost far from home, made monstrous by fear and shadow? Was it a warning sent from somewhere none of us understand? Or was it just a story, the kind of story a small town tells itself when the winters are long and the rivers are dark? Sit with me here a while. The fire is warm. The night is cold. And out past the edge of the porch light, where the woods begin, the legend of the Mothman is waiting to be told. Step a few miles north of town, past the last street light, past the last gas pump glowing yellow in the dusk. The road narrows there. The pavement turns to gravel, and the gravel turns to dirt, and the dirt runs straight into a forest that has been growing back for 20 years, slow and patient, the way forests do. This is where you'll find the TNT area. That's what folks in Point Pleasant called it, even in 1966. The name was a leftover, like an old coat hanging in a closet long after the owner moved away. During the Second World War, the United States Army built a plant out here in these woods. They made explosives, tons of them. The whole place was meant to feed the war machine, churning out powder for shells and bombs that would cross the ocean. When the war ended, the army packed up and left, but they left their bones behind. Concrete bunkers sat scattered through the trees like sleeping animals. The locals called them igloos. They were round and squat, half buried in the earth, with thick walls built to hold a blast inside. Some had iron doors that hung crooked on rusted hinges. Some had no doors at all, just dark open mouths that breathed cool air even on the warmest days. Grass grew over their backs. Vines crawled up their sides. From a distance, in the right light, they looked like green hills with secrets tucked inside them. Between the igloos, the woods grew thick. Oak and hickory and tall pine. Wild grape vines as fat as a man's wrist. The trails between the bunkers had once been paved roads, but the asphalt had cracked and buckled, and weeds shot up through every seam. Deer used those old roads now. Foxes, sometimes a stray dog, and on cold mornings, the fog gathered low in the hollows and made the whole place look like a painting half finished. A little further in, past a row of crumbling guard shacks, you'd come to the ponds. Cool, dark pools of water that filled the pits where the army had dumped chemicals during the war years. The water in those ponds had a strange color to it, a deep tea brown, and nothing much swam in them. Frogs stayed away. Cattails grew tall around the edges, brown and brittle in November, rattling like dry paper when the wind moved through. The autumn of 1966 was a cold one in West Virginia. The leaves had turned early, blazing orange and red along the river, and by mid-November, most of them had already fallen. The woods around the TNT area were skeleton woods. Bare branches scratched at a low gray sky. The air smelled of damp leaves and wet stone, and the faint chemical sweetness that still clung to those old ponds even after 2 decades. The town itself, down the road, was a quiet place. Point Pleasant had about 6,000 souls in those years. Brick storefronts lined Main Street. A rickshaw drugstore, a dime store with a soda fountain. The low hotel rose 4 stories tall at the corner of 6th and Main, its windows glowing warm in the early dusk. Pickup trucks parked along the curb, Chevys and Fords with rounded fenders, paint dulled by river weather. Men wore work jackets and trucker caps. Women wore wool coats and tied scarves under their chins. The radio played Patsy Cline and Marty Robbins, and the news out of Charleston. In every house, a black and white television flickered with the evening shows. Bonanza, The Andy Griffith Show, Walter Cronkite reading the war news from a place called Vietnam. The world felt big and strange in 1966, but Point Pleasant felt small and known. You could walk the whole downtown in 10 minutes. You could call the sheriff by his first name. You knew which porch light belonged to which family. Out past the edge of town, though, the TNT area sat in its own kind of silence. Teenagers drove out there to park. Hunters tracked deer through the bunker rows. Kids on bikes dared each other to peek inside the igloos and feel the cold breath that came drifting out. The place had a reputation already, even before November of that year. People said it was haunted in the loose way small towns say such things. People said you could hear noises out there at night. Tappings, hummings, the sound of something moving through dry leaves when no wind blew. Nobody took it too seriously. Not yet. The old powder plant was just a place where the war had ended and the woods had taken over. A forgotten corner of West Virginia, full of empty bunkers and brown water and bare November trees. That was about to change. Before the red eyes and the bridge and the headlines, there were just people. Quiet people. The kind of folks who lived their whole lives inside a 30-mile circle and never once felt cheated by it. To understand what happened in Point Pleasant, you have to know the hands that first told the story. You have to know the soil they came from. Start with the Gravediggers, 5 young men from Clendenin, a small town about 80 miles east of Point Pleasant, tucked into the green folds of the Elk River Valley. Their names were Kenneth Duncan and his 4 cousins. They were diggers by trade, hired by the local cemeteries to open the earth when a soul needed laying down. honest work, slow and steady, the kind that left calluses on the palm and dirt under the nails. They wore canvas jackets stiff from sweat and rain. Their boots were caked in red clay that never quite washed off, no matter how long they soaked them. On the afternoon of November 14, 1966, these 5 men drove south through the rolling country to a cemetery near Point Pleasant. The sky that day was the color of pewter, soft and low, the kind of sky that hangs over West Virginia in late autumn and seems to press the whole valley flat. The trees had already shed most of their leaves. Bare branches scraped the gray light like fingers. Smoke curled from chimneys in the hollers, thin and blue, smelling of oak and wet ash. They worked the grave that afternoon, shovels biting into the cold ground. The earth came up in slabs, dark and ribboned with roots. By dusk, they were tired in that good, hollow way working men get tired. They wiped their hands on their pants and stretched their backs. The light was draining out of the sky like water out of a basin. That was when Kenneth Duncan looked up. He saw something move in the trees above the cemetery. A shape, a figure that seemed to step out from behind a tall oak and stand there, watching. He said later it looked like a man, but not a man. The proportions were wrong. The shoulders were too wide, the body too still. It had no face he could make out, just a dark silhouette against the dying light, with 2 points glowing where eyes might be. Then it lifted from the ground, not jumped, not climbed, lifted, smooth and silent, like a kite caught in an updraft. The 5 gravediggers stood frozen in the cemetery, shovels in hand, watching this shape rise above the trees and glide off into the gathering dark. They did not stay to finish their work. They climbed into their truck and drove home with the radio off, none of them quite ready to say out loud what they had seen. Kenneth would later be the first to speak. He told a reporter, plainly and without flourish, that a brown human shape had flown over his head in a cemetery near Point Pleasant. He was not a man given to tall tales. He was a man who buried the dead for a living. He knew quiet, and he knew shadows, and he knew this was something else. Now picture the others who lived in this town. Picture Mary Hyre, the local correspondent for the Athens Messenger, a small, sharp-eyed woman with reading glasses always pushed up on her head. She kept her notebook in her coat pocket and her coffee cup always half full. She knew everyone in Point Pleasant by name. She knew whose roof was leaking and whose daughter was about to be married. When strange stories started reaching her desk, she did not laugh. She listened. She wrote them down in her tight, looping handwriting. Picture Deputy Millard Halstead, a tall man with a soft voice and a uniform pressed flat each morning by his wife. He had patrolled these roads for years. He knew every curve of Route 62, every fence post, every farmhouse light. He was not the kind of lawman who scared easy. He was the kind who took a breath, removed his hat, and asked you to start from the beginning. Picture the young couples in their second-hand cars, the farmers with mud on their cuffs, the factory workers walking home from the shift at midnight, lunch pails swinging at their sides. Picture the children in the windows of clapboard houses, watching the river. These were the people who would carry the story. Ordinary people with ordinary lives, who would soon find themselves trying to describe something they could not name. And it began, as so many strange tales do, with 5 tired men and a pair of red eyes shining above a quiet West Virginia grave. Roger Scarberry was 18 years old, and the world still felt like it belonged to him. He had a young wife named Linda. He had a steady job at the TNT plant ruins, where the government still paid men to keep watch over things that no longer needed watching. He had a 1957 Chevy with a long hood and a bench seat wide enough for 4. On the night of November 15, 1966, that was about all a young man in Point Pleasant needed. The town that evening looked the way small American towns looked back then. Porch lights glowed yellow against white siding. Chimneys breathed thin smoke into a cold sky. The smell of supper hung in the air on Main Street. Fried potatoes and pork chops and coffee left too long on the stove. Cars idled outside the Marathon station, where men in canvas jackets leaned on fenders and talked about football. The Ohio River moved slow and dark beyond the floodwall, carrying the chill of November south toward Huntington. Linda Scarberry was 17 pretty, in the quiet way country girls were pretty then. She wore her hair pinned back. She had been married only a few months. She and Roger lived with her parents in a small frame house, the kind with a kitchen warm enough to steam the windows. Her father, Park McDaniel, kept a careful eye on his daughter and her new husband, the way fathers did. Across town, Steve Mallette and his wife Mary worked at the same kinds of jobs that everyone seemed to work. Steve and Roger had been friends since boyhood. The four of them ran around together most weekends, sharing gas money and movie tickets and bottles of pop at the drive-in. They were poor in the way most of Point Pleasant was poor, which was to say they had enough for a tank of gas and a little change rattling in the ashtray. The town itself was a quiet thing. 8,000 souls, give or take. A courthouse with a clock tower that chimed on the hour. A J.C. Penney on Main Street. A diner called the Stardust, where the waitresses knew your coffee order before you sat down. The Silver Bridge stretched across the Ohio to Canoga, its painted span lit by a string of pale yellow lamps. Trucks crossed it day and night, hauling coal and steel and lumber. The bridge hummed when the wind blew. Folks said it sounded like a man whistling through his teeth. That Tuesday had been an ordinary Tuesday. Roger had worked. Linda had helped her mother peel potatoes for supper. Steve had come by in the afternoon to talk about nothing in particular. The sky over the Kanawha Hills had gone the color of pewter by 4 o'clock, the way it does in West Virginia in mid-November, when the daylight surrenders early and the cold settles in like an old dog finding its spot. The maples along the river had already dropped their leaves. The sycamores stood pale and bare, their bone-white branches scratching at the gray. After supper, the four of them piled into the Chevy. Roger took the wheel. Linda slid in beside him on the bench seat. Steve and Mary climbed in on the passenger side, knees touching, laughing about something small. The car smelled of vinyl and cold air and Roger's aftershave. The radio played low, some country song fading in and out as they passed under the power lines. They had no plan. They were young, and gasoline was cheap, and the night was open in front of them like a long, dark road. They drove out past the edge of town. They drove past the lumber yard and the feed store and the last street light on Lincoln Avenue. They drove the way young people drove in 1966, with the windows cracked even in November, letting the smell of the river and the wet leaves drift through the cab. The headlights washed over fence posts and mailboxes. Frost glittered on the grass like crushed glass. Their plan, if you could call it a plan, was to head out toward the old TNT area. It was where everybody went. The roads out there were empty. The kids would park among the concrete domes and the abandoned magazines and sit with the radio playing soft. It was a kind of teenage ritual, as common as a high school dance. The TNT area at night belonged to whoever had a car and a few hours to kill. Roger pressed the gas pedal a little harder than he should have. The Chevy's tires hummed on the cold asphalt. The headlights cut a tunnel through the dark. None of them knew yet. None of them could have known. They were just 4 young people in a fast car, chasing nothing in particular through the West Virginia night. The old plant gate rose up out of the dark like the entrance to a forgotten city. Steel arches, peeling paint, a guardhouse with no guard. The headlights of Roger Scarberry's 1957 Chevy swept across the gravel, and for one heartbeat, the high beams caught something standing just past the gatehouse. A shape that did not belong to any animal the 4 young people knew. Linda Scarberry would later say it was the eyes she saw first. 2 perfect circles set into the front of a tall gray body, glowing back at them like the reflectors on a bicycle. Only these reflectors held a color no bicycle ever wore. They burned a deep, hot red, the color of a wood stove's coals in the last hour before dawn. They did not blink. They did not waver. They simply watched. The car rolled forward another foot. The figure stood maybe 100 feet away, near the side of an old brick building the plant workers had once called the North Power House. It was taller than a man, much taller. Linda guessed 7 feet, maybe more. Its shoulders were broad and rounded, the way a heavy coat looks when a person is hunched against the cold. But there was no head, not a real one. The red eyes sat low on the chest, where a man's collarbones would be, as if the creature had no neck at all. Behind the figure, folded against its back, hung two long wings. They were not feathered like a bird's. They looked smooth and dark and leathery, more like the wings of a great bat or some long-extinct thing pressed into a museum slab. Mary Mallette grabbed Roger's arm. She did not scream. None of them screamed. The silence inside the car was the silence of four people who had run out of breath all at the same time. Roger threw the Chevy into reverse. Gravel popped beneath the tires. The headlights swung off the figure and out across the empty road. And for a moment, the dark swallowed everything. He spun the wheel. The car bounced over the broken pavement at the gate. And then they were back on the road to town, the speedometer climbing past 60, past 70, past anything the old back road was meant to hold. That should have been the end of it. A wild story to whisper about over coffee. But the story was not finished. As they came up out of the woods and onto the stretch of Route 62 that ran along the river bluff, Linda turned her head and looked at the bank beside the highway. The thing was there. It was standing in the tall grass beside the road, watching the car go past. The same gray body, the same red eyes. Then it crouched and it lifted into the air. It did not flap. That was the part that none of them could explain later. A bird flaps. A bat flaps. This thing rose straight up, the way a kite rises when the string is pulled. And then it leveled out and began to follow them. The wings opened. Linda said the span looked wider than the car was long. The wings stayed stiff and still, like the spread arms of a glider. And yet the creature kept pace, with a Chevy doing close to 100 miles an hour. The road climbed and dipped. The river ran black on their right, glinting now. And then, where the moon hit it through the trees, Roger pressed the gas pedal flat to the floor. The engine howled. Steve Mallette twisted in the back seat and stared up through the rear window. And what he saw, he would tell the sheriff word for word a few hours later. The thing was up above them, gliding along just behind the roof of the car, the two red eyes fixed downward and burning steady. A sound came through the metal of the car. Not a screech, not a cry. Mary said it sounded like a record played too fast, a high mechanical squeak that did not belong to any throat she could picture. Linda covered her ears. The squeak rose and fell with the rhythm of the wings that were not flapping. They crossed the city limits at a speed that should have killed them. The street lamps of Point Pleasant came up bright and yellow, and the thing lifted away. It rose up over the rooftops and was gone, swallowed by the dark above the river, as if streetlight itself were a thing it would not cross. Roger drove straight to the sheriff's office. None of them said a word the whole way. The windshield held only their reflections, 4 pale faces staring at something that was no longer there. The Scarberrys and the Mallets drove straight through the dark streets of Point Pleasant that November night, past the dim porch lights and the shuttered diner, all the way to the door of the Mason County Courthouse. Their hands were still shaking when they walked inside. Deputy Millard Halstead was the man on duty, and he had known these 4 young people most of their lives. He'd watched them grow up. He knew their parents. He knew when a kid was telling a tall tale and when a kid was scared down to the bone. These 4 were scared down to the bone. Halstead listened. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't crack a joke. He picked up his hat, climbed into his patrol car, and told them to follow him back out to the TNT area. The road was empty at that hour. The trees along Route 62 stood like tall black walls under a thin slice of moon. The deputy drove slowly, his headlights washing across the broken pavement and the rusted gates of the old powder plant. He searched. He walked the gravel near the abandoned generator building. He shined his flashlight into the weeds. He found nothing. No feathers, no tracks, no torn cloth. Only the soft wind moving through the pines and the distant croak of frogs down by the river. But when Halstead got back in his car and clicked on his police radio, the speaker began to make a sound he had never heard before. It buzzed. It whined. It crackled like 1,000 bees trapped inside a tin can. He shut the radio off, looked out at the dark trees, and felt something he could not explain. The deputy was not a man given to fancy ideas. Still, he wrote up the report exactly as the young people told it. Every word. By dawn, the story was loose in Point Pleasant. It moved the way news moves in small towns. It moved through the screen door of the general store, where farmers stopped for coffee and a packet of nails. It moved across the polished bar at the Riverside Tavern, where steelworkers traded gossip over cold bottles. It moved along the steps of the Baptist church after Sunday service, where ladies in wool coats leaned close and spoke in low voices. By Monday, half the county had heard. By Tuesday, the other half was arguing about it. The old-timers were the ones who got quiet. There was a man named Asa who ran a small repair shop near the river. He was past 80, with hands like cracked leather and a memory longer than the Ohio itself. He told anyone who would listen that he'd seen something strange near the TNT Igloos back in 1949. A tall shape standing in the brush. Eyes that caught the light wrong. He'd never told a soul because he didn't want folks thinking he'd lost his senses. A woman named Edna at the Methodist potluck remembered a story her grandmother used to tell. A winged thing along the river bottoms. Her grandmother called it a sign, a warning before sorrow. Edna hadn't thought of that story in 50 years. The Shawnee history came up too, the way it always did in Point Pleasant when something went wrong. People whispered about the old Chief Cornstalk, who had been killed near Fort Randolph back in 1777. They said he had laid a curse on the land with his dying breath. 2 centuries of bad luck, floods, fires, train wrecks, and now this thing with red eyes out by the powder plant. The young folks laughed at the curse talk. The old folks did not. At the tavern, theories piled up like cordwood. Some said it was a hoax. Some said it was a big heron, confused and lost. Some said it was a government experiment from the war years, something that had survived in the woods and finally come out. A retired airman swore it was an Air Force test gone wrong. A trapper said it was a thunderbird, the kind his grandfather had spoken of when he was a boy in the hollows. Nobody agreed. Everybody talked. And through it all, Deputy Halstead kept his head down and did his job. He didn't tell people what to think. He didn't tell them the radio had screamed in his car that night. He just kept the report on file and waited to see what would happen next. What happened next was that the phone at the courthouse started ringing. Other people other sightings, other pairs of red eyes in the dark, glowing from the brush along the back roads of Mason County. The story was no longer four scared young people in a beat-up Chevy. The story was growing wings of its own. By the morning after the Scarberrys came tearing into town, the story had grown wings of its own. It moved from porch to porch like smoke through a screen door. And by the time it reached the newsroom of the Athens Messenger, a copy editor sat staring at a wire report, tapping a pencil against the desk, looking for a word that would fit a headline. The creature in the report had no name. The witnesses called it a bird. They called it a man. They called it a thing with red eyes and wings that whispered like canvas snapping in the wind. None of those words would sit right in print. None of them would do the work a headline needs to do. Batman was on television that year. Children wore plastic capes to school. The campy show had filled the airwaves with masked figures and bright colors and villains who flew from rooftops. The copy editor turned the word over in his mind, then bent it sideways. Mothman. Just like that, the creature had a name. The name traveled faster than the creature ever did. By the next afternoon, every paper in the Ohio Valley carried it. By the week's end, the word had crossed state lines. Mothman, 2 syllables, soft as a moth's wing landing on a window screen. It stuck the way burrs stick to wool, but the land beneath that name was older than any newspaper. Long before the powder plant, long before the bridges, long before the river towns drew lines on maps, this stretch of ground had stories of its own. The Shawnee had lived here, and the Mingo, and others before them, whose names the rivers have forgotten. They walked the bottoms where the Ohio bends west, where the Kanawha empties in from the hills, where the soil is dark and the cane grows thick along the banks. There are stories the old people told, stories of a thunderbird that lived in the cliffs above the river. A great winged thing with eyes like coals, who watched over the bends where men crossed. Some said it brought warnings. Some said it brought storms. Some said it appeared only when something terrible was about to happen, hovering above the water like a piece of the sky come loose. Whether those stories are true, or whether they were told true and then changed in the telling. No one alive can say. The Shawnee were pushed west long ago. Their villages burned, their councils scattered. What remained of their stories came down in fragments, half remembered, sometimes carried by white settlers who heard them second-hand from traders and trappers. There was, in 1774, a battle here. The Battle of Point Pleasant. Some call it the first battle of the American Revolution, though historians still argue about that. The Shawnee chief Cornstalk led his warriors across the river that October morning, and the fighting raged in the woods all day. The dead lay among the sycamores. The river ran red in places, or so the stories say. Cornstalk made peace afterward. He came back to the fort years later as a guest, hoping to keep his people out of another war. The settlers killed him there, murdered him in a cabin along with his son and 2 others. Before he died, the legend says, he spoke a curse upon the land. 200 years of misfortune. Floods, fires, mine collapses, train wrecks, and stranger things still. Whether Cornstalk truly spoke those words, no one knows. The earliest written version of the curse appears nowhere in the records of that day. It surfaces later in newspapers, in pamphlets, in the slow accumulation of regional memory. Some historians think the curse was invented decades after his death, a story people built to explain a town that seemed to attract sorrow. Others think the curse is real, and that the land here has always been thin in the way some places are, where the veil between what we see and what watches us seems worn through. The Shawnee Thunderbird, the dying chief's last words, the red-eyed thing in the powder plant. They are not the same story, not exactly, but they share a horizon. A reporter in Ohio reached for a word from a comic book and gave the creature a name. The name was new. The thing behind the name might have been very old. That is how legends work in places like this. They borrow the shape of whatever language is handy, and they wear it for a while. And underneath the costume, the older shape keeps walking. By the time the word Mothman appeared in print, the creature had already been seen by half a dozen people. And the people of Point Pleasant were just beginning to understand that whatever had come to their town had no intention of leaving soon. third week of November, the story had spilled out past the kitchen tables and barber shops of Point Pleasant. It crossed the county line. It rode the wires from Charleston to Cincinnati, and it pulled people toward the little town like iron filings drawn to a magnet under glass. One of those people was a young reporter from the Athens Messenger, just over the Ohio line. He drove down in a borrowed car with a notebook tucked into his coat pocket. The roads grew narrow the closer he got. Bare sycamores leaned over the asphalt like pale ribs. The air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke, and the late sun threw long blue shadows across the fields. He started where any honest reporter would start. He went to the farms. The farms outside Point Pleasant sat tucked into the soft hills along the Ohio. White barns with rust-colored roofs, silos leaning a little to the west, long gravel drives that crunched under tires and sent the dogs running. Most of those farmers had lived on that land since their grandfathers cleared it. They knew every owl by its call. They knew which fox lived in which hollow. And when they spoke about what they had seen, they did not speak the way liars speak. A man named Ralph Thomas told him about a shape over the corn crib. It stood as tall as a man, the farmer said, but folded wrong, like a coat hung on a crooked nail. The eyes glowed red as the coils of an electric stove. Ralph had reached for his rifle, then thought better of it. Some things, he said, you do not shoot. You just close the door and wait. Down the road, a woman named Marcella showed the reporter the spot where her chickens had gone quiet. Not killed, not taken, just quiet for 3 days in a row, every evening at the same hour. The birds pressed themselves against the back wall of the coop and would not move. She had to carry their feed to them in the dark, with a kerosene lantern shaking in her hand. The reporter wrote it all down. He filled page after page in his small bound notebook. And then he started to notice the pattern that nobody had named yet. The farmers had stopped going outside at dusk. It was a small thing at first. A man who used to smoke his pipe on the porch now smoked it at the kitchen window. A woman who used to walk her cows in from the back pasture at sundown now sent her son out at 4 in the afternoon instead. The evening chores got done early. The barn doors got locked before the light went red over the river. Whole families ate supper with the curtains drawn. Nobody had told them to do this. No sheriff had warned them. No preacher had stood at the pulpit and said, "Stay inside." They had simply, quietly, all at once, decided. The way deer decide to leave a meadow before the storm comes. The reporter found that more unsettling than any single sighting. One man seeing a monster, that was a story. 100 families changing the shape of their days without speaking of it, that was something else. That was the land itself going still. He drove out to the edge of the TNT area as the sun dropped. The concrete igloos squatted in the brush like the half-buried eggs of some forgotten animal. Vines crawled up their sides. The doors hung open on rusted hinges, black inside, breathing out cold air that smelled of damp stone. He stood at the chain-link fence and listened. He heard nothing. No crickets, no frogs from the swampy ponds, no rustle in the dry weeds. The silence pressed against his ears like cotton. He noticed his own breath coming shallow, and he did not stay long. Back in town that night, he sat in a diner booth with the notebook open and a cup of coffee going cold beside it. He tried to write a lead. He tried 3 different leads. None of them felt right. The story was too big for the front page and too small for the truth. Some folks said later he saw something himself that night driving back to Athens. 2 red lights in his rearview mirror that kept pace too long, then dropped away. He never wrote about that part. He told a friend years later that he wished he had not gone looking at all, that some questions answer you back, and you cannot unhear the answer. He filed his piece. He moved on to other stories, but the notebook stayed in his desk drawer for the rest of his life, and he never opened it again. Newell Partridge lived alone on a farm in Salem, West Virginia, about 90 miles north of Point Pleasant. He kept to himself mostly, and he had a German shepherd named Bandit. That dog was the kind of dog a man builds his evenings around. Bandit slept on the porch, walked the fence line at dusk, and barked at anything that moved wrong in the trees. On the night of November 14th, 1966, Newell was sitting in his living room watching television when the picture began to twist. The screen folded in on itself. He said, like somebody had crumpled a piece of tinfoil and pressed it against the glass. Then came the sound, a high whine, like a generator winding up, coming from somewhere out past the hay barn. Bandit was already on the porch, hackles up, growling at something Newell couldn't see. Newell grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The beam swept across the dirt yard and caught 2 red circles in the dark. Not reflections, he said later. Not glass or bottle caps or the eyes of a deer. Red like the coils of an electric stove, set wide apart, low to the ground, but somehow tall, like the thing was crouched and ready. Bandit took off after it. Newell called the dog back. He called and called until his voice gave out. Bandit didn't come. Not that night. Not the next morning. Not ever. Newell walked his property for 3 days, calling that dog's name across the brown autumn fields. He found tracks once, near the edge of the woods, circling in a tight pattern like the dog had been chasing his own tail. Then nothing. Newell told the story to anyone who'd listen, and his voice would get soft when he got to the part about the eyes. He always said the same thing. He said he wished he'd never gone outside. 2 days later, when the Scarberrys and Mallets drove into the sheriff's office with their own story, one detail caught Newell's attention. They said they had seen something dead by the side of the road near the TNT area. A large shape, dark, with what looked like fur. They hadn't stopped to look. By the time anyone went back, the shape was gone. Newell never said for certain, but he believed, in the quiet way a farmer believes things, that whatever the Scarberrys saw flying beside their car had passed through his yard first. The stories of missing dogs spread through Mason County like pollen on the wind. A woman named Ruth Foster, who lived on a stretch of road outside Gallipoli's Ferry, said her beagle vanished one evening in late November. She had let him out to do his business, and she heard him bark once, a short, sharp bark, and then silence. She found his collar in the grass the next morning. The buckle was still latched. She kept that collar in a kitchen drawer for the rest of her life. She said sometimes, on cold nights, she'd open the drawer just to look at it, and she'd remember how the air had felt that evening, thick and still, like the whole world had stopped breathing. A boy named Tommy, only 13, told his mother he'd seen something in the field behind their house. He was looking for his pup, a little mutt named Sister, who had wandered off after dinner. Tommy said he climbed the back fence and walked into the corn stubble, calling her name. He heard a sound he couldn't place. A soft sound, he said, like wet leather being folded. He turned around and saw a shape standing maybe 40 feet away, taller than a man, with shoulders that hunched up around where its head should have been. Tommy ran. Sister never came home. The boy refused to walk in that field again, even years later, even as a grown man with children of his own. These were not people who wanted attention. They were quiet, careful folks who took their stories to the sheriff and then took them home and put them away. They didn't write books. They didn't go on television. They just lived with the knowing, the way you live with a scar. Something had passed through their lives that they couldn't name, and it had taken something small from each of them, and then it had gone. Whether what they saw was the same thing the Scarberrys saw, no one can prove. Whether their dogs ran toward it or away from it, no one can say. But the pattern was there, threaded through the back roads and farm porches of Mason County like a single dark stitch. Eyes the color of stove coils, a whining sound on the wind, and dogs that never came back. By the middle of November in 1966, the stories in Point Pleasant had started to fold into one another. People who lived on opposite ends of the county were telling the same details. A shape with wings, eyes that glowed red like the coals at the bottom of a wood stove, a sound like a sewing machine left running in an empty room. None of these people knew each other. None of them had read the same article. And yet, when the sheriff's deputies sat down at kitchen tables and wrote things in their little notebooks, the descriptions matched, line for line, as if everyone had been handed the same script. The lights came next. Or maybe the lights had been there all along, and people only started noticing once their eyes had something to look for. Farmers in Mason County began calling the newspaper to talk about strange glows above the cornfields, soft round lights that hung over the dry stalks at night, hovering low, the color of a peach left too long in the sun. They did not blink the way airplane lights blink. They did not move the way stars move. They sat. They waited. And then, quiet as a yawn, they slid sideways and vanished into the trees. One farmer outside Gallipoli's ferry said he watched a light the size of a tractor wheel float over his pumpkin patch for almost half an hour. He sat on his porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands, too curious to be afraid. The light cast no shadow on the ground. The corn beneath it did not sway. When it finally drifted away, his old hound dog, who had not moved from beneath the porch the whole time, came out and looked up at the sky and let out one low, tired howl. Then the dog went inside and lay down on the rug and did not eat for 2 days. Down in the TNT area, the patterns kept rhyming. The same gravel turnouts, the same bend in the road, the same time of evening, somewhere between supper and full dark, when the sky turned the color of wet slate and the trees seemed to lean inward. 3 different couples parked in 3 different cars on 3 different nights all reported the same thing. A shape rising up from behind one of the concrete domes. Wings spreading like a great gray bedsheet snapped open in the wind. And those eyes, always the eyes, hanging in the dark like 2 stoplights that had floated free of their poles. Mary Hyre kept track of it all on yellow legal pads at her desk at the Athens Messenger. She drew little maps. She marked little dates. She made little columns of names. And slowly, on the paper in front of her, a shape began to appear that none of the individual witnesses could see from where they stood. The sightings were not scattered. They were clustered. They formed a rough ring around the old powder plant, with spokes reaching out along Route 62 and down toward the river. The lights, when she plotted them, hovered along the same lines, as if something were drawing a circle in the air above Point Pleasant, and the people below were only catching glimpses of the chalk. There was something else, too. The animals, dogs that would not go outside after dark, cattle that pressed themselves against the far corners of their pastures, birds that seemed to have left the woods entirely, leaving a silence behind that the old-timers said felt wrong. The way a clock feels wrong when it stops ticking in another room. A woman near Tyler Creek said her chickens stopped laying for nearly a week. Another family, out by the old cemetery said their barn cats simply walked off into the woods one evening and did not come back until spring. The strangest part was how ordinary it all felt to the people living through it. There were no sirens, no headlines screaming from the front page. Life went on. Children went to school. Trucks rolled across the silver bridge. The diners served coffee and biscuits at 6 in the morning. But underneath the ordinary surface, a quiet pattern was forming, like frost spreading across a window pane in shapes nobody had drawn. Some folks today look back at those weeks and see the early signs of a mass story taking shape. Neighbors borrowing details from neighbors without meaning to. Others look back and see something stranger, something that was already there in the fields and the woods and the soft, round lights above the corn, waiting patiently for the town to finally look up and notice it had company. Hyre kept a small office on Main Street in Point Pleasant. She was the local stringer for the Athens Messenger, a short woman with tired eyes and a soft Ohio Valley accent. She knew everyone in town. She knew the deputies, the bridge workers, the farmers, the wives who called her with rumors before they called the church. By the winter of 1966, her desk had become the quiet heart of the whole strange story. People walked through her door with their hats in their hands. They sat down in the chair across from her, and they told her things they could not tell their husbands. Her office smelled of cigarette smoke and printer ink. A green desk lamp threw a small pool of light across her papers. The windows looked out on the gray river and the bridge that hummed faintly in the cold. Mary listened. She wrote things down in shorthand. She did not laugh, and she did not flinch. Then, one morning in January of 1967, 2 men came to see her. They wore dark suits, the kind a man might wear to a funeral. Their ties were thin and black. Their shoes were polished to a mirror shine, which was strange, because the streets outside were full of slush and red mud. Mary later said their skin looked smooth in an odd way, like wax left near a warm stove. Their hair was cut short and combed flat against their heads. They did not smile. They asked her about the sightings. They asked about the people who had come to her office. They wanted names. They wanted the addresses of the farmers out on the back roads. They spoke in flat voices, with no music in them, like men reading from a card. Mary said one of them picked up a ballpoint pen from her desk. He turned it over slowly in his fingers. He stared at it the way a child stares at a beetle. Then he asked her, in that same empty voice, what it was for. She told him it was a pen. He put it in his pocket and walked out the door without another word. The other man followed. They climbed into a long black car parked at the curb. The car had no markings. No one in town recognized it. It rolled away down Main Street and turned at the corner by the courthouse, and then it was gone. Mary sat at her desk for a long time after. She lit a cigarette. She watched the smoke curl up toward the green lamp. Then she picked up the phone and called a man in New York named John Keel. She told him what had happened. Keel had been writing to her for weeks. He had heard whispers of these men from other reporters in other small towns. He told her to write everything down, every detail, the color of their eyes, the cut of their suits, the pen. In the weeks that followed, Mary heard more stories. A woman out near the TNT area said 2 men in dark suits had knocked on her door at supper time. They asked her about lights in the sky. They drank the coffee she offered, but they drank it too fast, all at once, as if they had never tasted it before. One of them spilled his on his shirt and did not seem to notice the stain. A farmer named Mr. Thomas said a black sedan had followed him home from the feed store. When he stopped, the car stopped. When he drove on, it followed at the same slow distance. He told Mary the driver wore sunglasses, even though the sun was long gone behind the hills. The stories piled up on Mary's desk like winter leaves. Some folks said the men flashed badges that did not look quite right. The letters were wrong. The seals looked hand-drawn. Some folks said the men asked questions a stranger should not know to ask. They knew about phone calls made in the dark. They knew about dreams. No one ever found out who they were. The government denied sending anyone. The state police had no record. The FBI shrugged. Yet the stories were the same in every farmhouse and every kitchen. Dark suits, black cars, voices like dry leaves, today say these were just rumors, fed by movies and pulp magazines and the long winter nights. Others say something real walked through Point Pleasant that winter. Something dressed up to look like a man, but not quite managing it. Mary Hyre never said which side she believed. She only kept writing. She kept her notes in a drawer beside the green lamp, and she watched the bridge hum through the cold glass. John Keel came to Point Pleasant in the winter of 1966 with a notebook, a heavy coat, and a mind already half tilted toward the strange. He was a writer from New York, a man who had spent years chasing stories that other reporters wouldn't touch. He had walked through the deserts of Egypt looking for ghosts. He had sat with snake charmers in India. He had filed columns for newspapers about flying saucers when most editors considered the subject a joke. He read about the red-eyed creature in a small wire story tucked between farm reports and football scores. Something about it pulled him west. He packed his bag, boarded a bus, and rode through the cold, gray hills of the Appalachians until the road dropped him at the place where the Ohio and the Kanawha met. The town in winter looked like a postcard left out in the rain. Brick storefronts the color of old pennies. Bare sycamores leaning over the river. Smoke curling from chimneys in thin white ribbons. Snow gathered in the gutters and along the wrought iron rails of the silver bridge. The whole valley felt hushed, as if it were holding its breath. Keel checked into a small hotel near the courthouse. He found Mary Hyre at the Athens Messenger Bureau, and the two of them became friends in the way that strangers do when they share a strange secret. She gave him names. She gave him phone numbers. She gave him a map of the TNT area with little marks where sightings had happened. Keel began driving the back roads at dusk with his notebook on the passenger seat. What he wrote down over the next year would fill an entire book. But there was one detail, one impossible thing that he would return to again and again for the rest of his life. It came from his own telephone. Keel had given his New York number to a handful of witnesses. He told them to call if anything else happened, and the phone began to ring. Not always with witnesses. Sometimes the line would open, and there would be only a humming sound, like the inside of a beehive. Sometimes a voice would speak, and the voice would know things it should not have known. It would name the restaurant where he had eaten lunch that day. It would describe the color of the tie he had been wearing. It would mention a private conversation he had held with Mary Hyre in her kitchen, with the doors closed and the curtains drawn. The voice would say these things calmly, without menace, as if reciting the weather. Keel was a careful man. He checked his rooms for hidden microphones. He found none. He changed his hotel. He changed his routine. He used pay phones at random stops along Route 62. The calls kept coming. The voice kept knowing. One evening, the voice on the line gave him a prediction. It said the power would go out across the eastern seaboard at a precise hour on a precise night. Keel wrote the date in his notebook and circled it twice. The night came. The power did not go out, but somewhere in the Midwest, at the very minute the voice had named, a single transformer failed and plunged a small town into darkness. Keel sat alone in his hotel room and stared at his notebook for a long time. Half right. The voice had been half right. He could not decide whether that was more frightening than being fully right, or less. He never solved it. He spent the rest of his life turning that detail over in his hands like a stone he had picked up on a strange beach. He wrote about it in his book, The Mothman Prophecies. He spoke about it on radio shows and at conferences. He admitted plainly that he did not know what the voice was. He did not know if it was a person, a hoax, a hallucination, or something that lived in the spaces between radio waves. He only knew that it had been real. He had heard it. Mary Hyre had heard versions of it too. So had others in town. The calls had a pattern. They came at odd hours. They left the listener feeling hollowed out, as if a cold wind had passed through the room. You can hold a feather in your hand and decide it is a feather. You can hold a footprint and decide it is a footprint. But what do you do with a voice on a telephone that knows the color of your tie? There is no museum case for that. There is no photograph. There is only the memory of a man sitting in a small hotel room above the Ohio River, listening. Not everyone in Point Pleasant believed the stories. Plenty of folks rolled their eyes and went back to their coffee. They had reasons, good ones, and it's only fair to sit with those reasons for a while. The doubters pointed to the simple shape of things. A big bird in the dark looks like a monster. A flashlight beam bouncing off two reflective eyes looks like fire. The mind fills in the rest. People had been watching scary movies that fall. The radio played stories of the strange. A whole town was primed to see something, and so a whole town saw it. The skeptics had a name for this. They called it suggestion. One person sees a shape. They tell a neighbor. The neighbor goes out the next night, already half expecting wings. The brain is a soft, eager thing. It finishes pictures before they are done. By the time the story reached the third teller, the eyes were redder, the wings were wider, the night was darker. There were practical answers too. The sandhill crane stood almost 5 feet tall. It had a wingspan close to 7. Its eyes glowed orange when light caught them right. Cranes had been spotted off their normal path that year, drifting south through strange country. A bird like that, lifting up from a ditch beside Route 62, would look like nothing the Scarberrys had ever seen. They were young. They were already scared. The night was already strange. The barn owl was the other suspect. White face, black eyes, a soft floating flight that made no sound at all. An owl coming out of the rafters in an old powder plant would seem to drop from nowhere. The eyes would shine like coins in a flashlight beam. The wings would brush the air without a whisper. To a person standing in the dark of the TNT area, an owl could become anything at all. The skeptics had answers for the dogs too. Dogs ran off all the time in farm country. Coyotes took them. Cars hit them. They wandered into the woods chasing scent and never found their way back. A missing dog was not proof of a monster. It was Tuesday. Even the Silver Bridge had its plain answer, though that part comes later. For now, picture a town full of reasonable people standing on their porches, shaking their heads at the talk. They were not cruel about it. They just did not see what their neighbors saw. They knew birds. They knew shadows. They knew how a story grows when it travels from kitchen to kitchen. The skeptics made a strong case. They still do. Most modern researchers who look at Point Pleasant lean toward the bird theories, or toward something folklorists call mass sociogenesis. That is a long phrase for a simple idea. People in close communities, under stress, sometimes share the same vision. They feed each other's fear. They build a creature together out of scraps of real things. That theory explains a lot. It explains why the sightings clustered. It explains why the descriptions matched. It explains why the whole thing faded after the bridge fell, and the town's grief found a real target. But it does not explain everything. And this is the place where even the doubters go quiet. It does not explain the phone calls. Through that long winter, people across Point Pleasant picked up their receivers and heard things that should not have been there. Voices speaking in tongues no one knew. Beeping patterns that repeated in strange rhythm. Conversations that seemed to be happening in another room far away, between strangers who never gave their names. Some folks heard their own words played back to them, slightly delayed, like an echo from a deep well. Mary Hyre kept notes on these calls. So did John Keel. So did dozens of ordinary people who had no reason to lie and nothing to gain by being laughed at. The calls came at strange hours. 3 in the morning, just before dawn. They came to people who had seen the creature, and to people who had only written about it, and to people who had simply lived nearby. A bird cannot dial a phone. A shared vision cannot make a receiver click and hum. Mass hysteria does not whisper numbers in a flat voice and then hang up. The skeptics shrug at this part. They say the phone lines were old. They say pranksters worked the wires. They say cold weather did funny things to copper. Maybe so. Maybe all of it. But the calls came, and the people who took them remembered the sound for the rest of their lives. Not everyone in Point Pleasant ran from the thing in the woods. Some of them sat with it. Some of them turned it over in their hands like a smooth river stone, studied it, named it, and decided it was theirs to carry. These were the believers. The men and women who had seen something with their own eyes and refused to unsee it, no matter how many neighbors crossed the street to avoid them. You have to picture what that took. Point Pleasant in 1967 was a town of about 6,000 people. Everyone knew everyone. The mailman knew your dog's name. The pharmacist knew your mother's prescription. If you said you saw a winged creature out by the powder plant, that story walked into church with you on Sunday. It sat next to you at the diner. It followed your kids to school. And still, they spoke. Linda Scarberry kept a journal, page after page in steady handwriting, dated and timed, every sighting noted like a farmer notes the weather. She did not write it for fame. She wrote it because she needed to be sure of her own mind. The pages described red eyes glowing at the edge of the yard, lights moving slow above the rooftops, the hum of something just beyond the porch light. Her husband Roger spoke too, calm and plain, the way a man talks about an engine that won't start. He had seen the thing. He was not going to lie about it. Out in the hills, an old contractor named Ralph Thomas told anyone who would listen about the lights. Soft red orbs drifting along the power lines near the TNT area. They moved against the wind. They paused at the wires like they were reading them. Ralph had spent 40 years working outdoors. He knew what airplanes looked like. He knew what swamp gas looked like. This, he said, was neither. Mary Hyre kept taking the calls. She filled notebooks with names and times and small details. A farmer's wife who heard a high warbling sound at 3 in the morning. A boy who said the creature stood between 2 pine trees and watched him through the kitchen window. A grandmother who claimed a voice came through her telephone and warned her not to drive to Mason County on Friday. The grandmother did not drive that Friday. She never drove anywhere again without thinking about it. These were the whispered warnings, strange messages that came through phones, through dreams, through the static between radio stations. Some folks said the creature itself was trying to tell them something. Others said it was the men in black, testing how much the town would believe. A few quiet voices said the warnings came from somewhere stranger still, a place none of them could name. And the believers held onto these warnings like keepsakes. They told the stories slowly, in kitchens, with the curtains drawn over coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. They did not raise their voices. They did not argue with the doubters. They simply knew there was a cost to knowing. Jobs grew harder to keep when the boss thought you were chasing ghosts. Children came home from school with red ears and bruised knuckles. reporters from out of town arrived with shiny shoes and condescending smiles, asked their questions, and left with the answers already written in their heads. But there was also a gift. The believers found each other. They sat on porches together at dusk and watched the tree line. They drove the back roads in slow, patient loops, headlights painting the dirt gold. They built a small, quiet brotherhood of people who had stood at the edge of something vast and had not looked away. Connie Carpenter, who had seen the creature swoop low over her car as she drove home from church, said it gave her a strange kind of peace. Not comfort exactly, something deeper. The world was bigger than she had thought. The map had blank spaces on it after all. She felt smaller and somehow more held. That feeling spread. The believers began to speak of the creature less as a monster and more as a messenger. A warning bell with wings. Something that had come to Point Pleasant because Point Pleasant needed warning, though for what, none of them yet knew. The power lines hummed above the cornfields. The red lights drifted. The phones rang at odd hours with voices that did not quite belong to anyone. And the believers wrote it all down. They told their children. They told their grandchildren. They built the story brick by careful brick, knowing that someday the rest of the country would want to hear it, and knowing too that by then the witnesses themselves might be gone. Before the Scarberrys ever drove past the old powder plant, before John Keel filled his notebook with strange phone calls, the land around Point Pleasant already carried a story. The old folks in the hills will tell you the ground itself remembers. Stone and root and river bend, hold onto things people forget. And if you walk the bluffs above the Ohio at dusk, you can almost feel it listening back. The story goes back to 1774. A Shawnee chief named Cornstalk led his warriors to the place where the Kanawha River pours itself into the Ohio. There, on the flat green point of land that gives the town its name, he fought the Virginia militia in a long, bloody day called the Battle of Point Pleasant. The cottonwoods along the bank turned red that autumn, and the river ran slow and dark beneath them. Cornstalk lost more men than he could count, but he walked away alive. 3 years later, he came back under a flag of truce. He carried weapon. He came to warn the settlers that other tribes were stirring, that war was coming up the valleys like smoke. The militia at Fort Randolph took him in, then took him hostage, then shot him down inside the walls of their own fort. His son was with him. They killed the boy too. The legend says that Cornstalk, in his last breath, laid a curse on that ground. A 200-year curse, some tell it. He swore the soil of Point Pleasant would know sorrow, and flood, and fire, and strange visitations, until the land was paid back for what was taken. Then he closed his eyes, and the river kept rolling, and the cottonwoods went on dropping their leaves into the brown water. You can argue the curse never happened. Historians point out that no record from 1777 mentions any dying words at all. The story shows up later, passed mouth to mouth, growing thicker the way river fog grows thicker before dawn. Some folklorists think the curse was invented in the 1800s, stitched together to explain a string of bad luck the town could not otherwise hold. Floods in 1913. A steamboat that burned to the waterline. A munitions blast during the First World War. A tornado that skipped right through the bottomland. Yet other folks say it does not matter whether Cornstalk spoke the words. The land itself answered, and that is enough. Walk the river bluffs in late autumn, and you will see what they mean. The cottonwoods along certain stretches grow crooked, leaning toward the water like old men bowing. Their trunks split and rejoin and split again. The bark looks bruised. In the meadows between the TNT bunkers, the grass comes in patchy and yellow in places where the soil should be rich. And farmers in the 1950s gave up trying to plow there. Some old foundations west of town never held square. A barn built in 1922 sagged into the earth within a decade, as if the ground beneath it could not bear the weight of a roof. The animals notice things people miss. There is a meadow near the McClintock Refuge where the deer will not bed down. Hunters have known it for generations. The grass is tall and sweet, and the cover is good, but no track ever crosses it. Coon dogs that range freely over every hollow in the county will circle that meadow and refuse to step inside. Farmers say their cattle drift toward the far fences when the wind blows out of that direction. ears flat, tails low, breathing through wide nostrils. And the river itself has shifted. Old maps from the 1820s show the Ohio cutting a different curve below the point, hugging the West Virginia bank tighter than it does today. Somewhere in the last century, the channel slid west by 100 yards or more. The current changed its mind. Sandbars rose where deep water used to run, and the willows took root in places that used to be river bottom. Engineers will tell you rivers always wander. Old-timers will tell you this one wandered for a reason. Whether you believe in Cornstalk's curse, or you believe in nothing but geology and bad luck, the fact remains that this little patch of bottomland has gathered more strange stories than any town its size should hold. The Shawnee called this confluence a holy place long before the militia arrived. They said spirits crossed here, that the water carried voices, that the point of land between two rivers was a doorway. Doorways, they said, swing both ways. So, when a creature with red eyes rose out of the TNT woods in November of 1966, it did not rise into empty country. It rose into ground that already remembered. Step back from Point Pleasant for a moment. Look at the bigger map of America in the years after the war. All across the country, the government built places like the TNT area, hidden powder plants in the woods, bunkers shaped like little hills, covered in grass and vines, forgotten storage sites where the trees grew back faster than anyone expected. These places have a strange habit of becoming legend grounds. The land remembers what was buried there, and the stories rise up out of the soil like fog. The igloos at Point Pleasant were dome-shaped concrete shelters, round on top, flat on the bottom, set into the earth like turtle shells half buried in moss. From the air, they looked like a field of stone mushrooms. From the ground, they looked like ancient burial mounds. Inside, the air stayed cool even in summer. The walls dripped with slow water. The ceilings echoed back every whisper. After the war ended, the doors were locked, but rust ate the locks. Kids found ways in. Hunters used them for shelter. The igloos became dark rooms with dirt floors, scattered with leaves and the bones of small animals. swore something lived in them. The same shape of story shows up in other places too. In Flatwoods, West Virginia, less than 2 hours from Point Pleasant, a group of children and a mother climbed a dark hill in 1952. They saw a tall figure with glowing eyes and a metallic body hovering just above the grass. They called it the Flatwoods Monster. It vanished into the woods and was never seen again. Same state, same kind of forest, same red glow at the edge of memory. Down in Texas, near the old munitions depot at Camp Bowie, locals tell of a black figure that walked the perimeter at night. Up in Maine, near the abandoned radar stations of the Cold War, fishermen spoke of tall things that stood on the rocks at dusk. In New Mexico, near Los Alamos, ranch hands described lights that hovered over the mesa and shapes that walked between the junipers. The places where America stored its secrets seem to attract its strangest visitors. Some folklorists have noticed the pattern. They call it the haunted installation effect. Wherever the government built something big and then walked away, the stories followed. Empty barracks, drained reservoirs, fenced-off woods, with no signs explaining why. The human mind fills empty spaces with watchers. The land, once disturbed, never quite settles back to sleep, but the believers tell it differently. They say these places were never truly empty. The bunkers and igloos and concrete domes were doorways. Something about the shapes, the buried geometry, the long quiet, drew things in. The igloos at Point Pleasant, with their cool, dark interiors and their ring-like layout in the trees, were perfect dens. Whatever the creature was, it had found a home, sheltered from the rain, hidden from the road, surrounded by acres of overgrown forest where nothing came hunting it. Locals would tell you about the smell, a sour metal smell that hung around certain igloos and not others. Hunters described their dogs refusing to go near. One man said he tried to sleep off a long day inside one of the domes and woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of slow breathing that wasn't his own. He walked out without his rifle and never went back for it. The same kind of breathing shows up in Mothman stories from other states. In Chicago, in 2017, a wave of black-winged sightings rolled through the city. People on rooftops, drivers on the expressway, dog walkers in the parks, all describing a tall figure with red eyes and silent wings. Different city, different decade, same shape rising at the corner of a streetlight. In Cornwall, England, a creature called the Owlman appeared near an old church in 1976. Glowing eyes and feathered body, hovering above the trees. The legend traveled across the ocean, or maybe it was always there, waiting in the same kind of forest. What ties these places together is not a creature. It is a feeling. The feeling that some patches of the country, marked by war, secrecy, or old grief, hold a kind of charge. People walk into them and come out with the same story, even when they have never heard it before. Glowing eyes, silent flight, the sense of being watched by something patient. The TNT igloos still sit out there today, slumped under decades of vines. The doors hang open. The wind moves through them and makes a low organ sound. And the stories, like the vines, keep growing thicker every year, wrapping the concrete in something older than concrete itself. The winter of 1966 into 1967 came down on Point Pleasant like a slow gray hand. Snow gathered along the fence lines. The Ohio River ran black between white banks, and in those cold months, the sightings did not stop. They piled up like the firewood stacked beside every back door in town. What survives from that winter is small. A handful of police logs, written in pencil and ballpoint. A few yellowed clippings from the Point Pleasant Register. Photographs taken on box cameras, the kind with square flash bulbs that popped and faded. Letters tucked into shoeboxes. Notebooks scribbled in a hurry. Things you can hold in your hand and turn toward the lamp. The police log from the Mason County Sheriff's Office shows entries you might miss if you weren't looking. A call about a strange shadow near Camp Conley Road. A complaint from a farmer whose chickens had stopped laying. A note about a man on Tyler Creek who said something tall stood in his pasture at dusk. The handwriting is plain. The ink has faded to the color of weak tea. No flourishes, no drama, just the small bookkeeping of a town that didn't know what else to do with what people kept telling them. There is a photograph that still floats around in old folders grainy reprints. It shows the TNT area in winter, the concrete igloos squatting under bare trees, the ground crusted with frost. In the corner of the frame, near the tree line, there is a shape, a dark smudge with what might be shoulders. It might be a deer. It might be a shadow on the film. It might be nothing at all. But people in Point Pleasant kept that photo. They passed it around at the diner. They held it up to the window light and squinted. Mary Hyre, the reporter, kept her own private files. She wrote in a small notebook with a green cloth cover, and the pages filled fast. Names and dates. Phone numbers scratched in the margins. Quick sketches of what people described to her, drawn in the kind of nervous lines you make when you don't quite trust your own hand. Some of those pages still exist, kept in archives and private collections. The pencil has smudged in places. The paper has gone soft as old linen, but the words are still there, careful and steady. Children that winter brought home drawings from school. Crayon pictures of a tall figure with red dots for eyes. Mothers tucked them into kitchen drawers without knowing why. Years later, those drawings turned up in attic boxes when the houses were cleaned out. Faded blue wax, faded red wax, the shape always the same, wings folded down the back like a long coat. A man named Newell Partridge, who lived across the river in Salem, kept a small piece of his own story. His television had gone strange one night, the screen filling with patterns like a peacock's tail. His dog Bandit had run off into the field and never come home. Partridge saved the broken bit of the television tube and the dog's collar. He kept them in a cigar box on a shelf in the garage. He showed them to anyone who asked. The leather of the collar had gone stiff. The tube was just dark glass, but he kept them because they were the only things left. Letters went out from Point Pleasant that winter, sent to relatives in Ohio, in Kentucky, in places as far as California. People mentioned the sightings in passing, the way you mention a long snow or a cousin's wedding. There's been a thing in the woods out by the old plant, one letter reads. Folks have seen it. I don't know what to think. The handwriting is careful. The stamp is a 6-cent flag. The envelope is the color of cream gone slightly off. A few hunters claimed to have found tracks, three-toed prints pressed into the mud near the river, larger than any bird should leave. Plaster casts were made by men who knew how to make them. The casts have mostly been lost, broken, or thrown out, or stored in basements that flooded. But photographs of them remain. White shapes against dark cloth, a ruler laid alongside for scale. None of it proves anything. A blurry photo can be a deer. A drawing can be a child's dream. A dog collar can be just a dog collar. But all together, gathered up in the slow drift of one West Virginia winter, the small things weigh more than they should. They sit in boxes and folders and drawers across the Ohio Valley. Quiet, yellowed, waiting for someone to pick them up again and ask what they mean. Sit at any kitchen table in Point Pleasant on a winter night, and sooner or later, the talk turns to the bridge. Not the new one, the old one. The silver bridge, painted the color of pewter, strung across the Ohio River like a length of jeweled chain. Grandparents speak of it the way other families speak of lost dogs or lost houses, with a softness in the voice, with the eyes drifting to the window, toward the place where the river still runs cold. The stories pass down in pieces. A grandmother tells her grandchildren about the way the bridge looked at sunset, the steel turning rose gold, the cars crawling across it bumper to bumper on a Friday evening. A great uncle remembers the sound it made in the cold months. A low hum, he says, a vibration you could feel through the soles of your boots if you stood near the anchor on the West Virginia side. The whole structure would sing under the weight of traffic, a metal lullaby drifting out across the water. Some families say the hum changed in the last weeks of 1967. It grew deeper, slower, a note that did not belong. The old folks who worked the river will tell you the bridge had moods, the way an old horse has moods. And in those final December days, the mood went strange. The cables looked tired. Frost gathered on the rivets in patterns nobody had seen before. Fine white ferns blooming across the iron. These details may be true. They may be memory polished by 1,000 retellings, the way a stone in a creek bed grows smooth. But the people who lived through that winter swear by them, and their children swear by them, and their children's children carry the story forward like a candle, passed hand to hand. One family in Gallipoli, just across the water, tells a story about a great-grandfather who refused to drive the bridge that month. He was a plain man, a butcher, not given to fancies. But he came home one evening in early December and told his wife he would not cross the Silver Bridge again until spring. He could not say why. Something in the air above it, he said. Something pressing down. His wife scolded him for the inconvenience. He stood firm. He drove the long way around, up through Henderson, for the next 2 weeks. The family still tells that story at Thanksgiving, and the cranberries get passed around, and somebody always says the same line at the end. He felt it coming. He just felt it. Other families tell quieter stories. A mother who dreamed of dark water 3 nights running and woke each time with her hands cold. A boy who saw a great shape standing on the bridge railing at dusk, wings half open, head turned toward the Ohio shore. He told his father, and his father laughed, and his father stopped laughing a few weeks later and never laughed about it again. Each telling shapes the tale. Some details get polished bright. Some details get quietly set aside. A cousin who once swore he heard a voice in his radio loses that line by the 3rd generation. The great shape on the railing grows, wings in one branch of the family, and loses them in another. A pair of red eyes appears in one telling, then vanishes, then returns. The story breathes. It rearranges itself around the dinner plates and the coffee cups. What does not change is the bridge. The bridge always hums. The bridge always carries that low, strange note in the final days. The river always runs slate gray beneath it, ice forming along the slow eddies near the banks. The sky always hangs low and heavy, the color of wet wool, pressing down on the rooftops of Point Pleasant and Canoga and Gallipoli. This is how folklore lives, not in books, not in newspaper clippings yellowing in library basements. It lives in the mouths of grandmothers. It lives in the long pause a grandfather takes before he answers a child's question. It lives in the way a family looks at the river when they cross the new bridge, the one built later, the one that does not hum. The historians will tell you what the records show. The engineers will tell you what the steel did. Folklorists will tell you how stories shift and bend over time, growing legs they did not have, losing limbs they once wore. All of these things are true, and still the families keep talking. They keep setting an extra place at the table in their own quiet way for the people who did not come home that December. They keep listening for the hum that nobody hears anymore. December 15th, 1967. A Friday. Cold the way only river towns get cold, where the damp climbs up from the water and settles into the bones of every house along the bank. The sky over Point Pleasant hung low and gray that morning, the color of old pewter. Frost lined the edges of the windows. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin white ribbons that bent sideways in the wind. By now, you have heard all the arguments, the believers and the skeptics, the barn owls and the men in dark suits, the Cornstalk curse and the cold logic of folklore. You have heard reporters and farmers and sheriffs and strangers from out of town. You have heard about red eyes and singing bridges and prophecies whispered through telephone wires that never should have rung. Set all of that down for a moment. Let it rest on the table like a heavy stone, because underneath the noise, underneath the debate, there is a quieter truth. And the quieter truth is this: something happened in Point Pleasant, something that mattered. You can argue about the shape of the thing in the woods. You can argue about whether John Keel got it right or wrong. You can argue about owls and water birds and tricks of the moon. But you cannot argue about the people. The people were real. Their fear was real. Their sleeplessness was real. The way they pulled their curtains tighter at dusk was real. The dogs that did not come home were really gone. The neighbors who stopped visiting after dark really stopped visiting. A town held its breath for 13 months. That part is not a story. That part is history. And on this morning, December 15th, the town was still holding its breath. Children walked to school with their scarves pulled high. Shopkeepers swept the frost from their stoops. The diner on Main Street served coffee in heavy white mugs that warmed cold hands. Trucks rolled down toward the river with their loads of coal and Christmas trees and parcels wrapped in brown paper. Folks were getting ready for the holiday. red ribbons stiff from the wind. The silver bridge stood at the south end of town, where the Ohio River curved like a long gray ribbon between West Virginia and Ohio. Its cables stretched in tall arcs against the winter sky. Cars crossed it the way they had crossed it for 40 years. Steel and shadow, and the soft thunder of tires over old planking. This is the part of the story where the chroniclers and the skeptics finally stand still together. Because what comes next does not need a monster to be terrible. It does not need a prophecy. It does not need anything at all but the simple weight of an ordinary Friday turning into something nobody would ever forget. Step back further. Look at the town the way a hawk might see it from high above. Look at the rooftops dusted with frost, the smoke threading upward, the river bending like dark glass, the bridge crossing it in two slow steel curves, the TNT igloos out in the woods to the north, half buried under brown winter leaves, the little farms scattered along the back roads, the church steeples, the schoolyards, the cemeteries on the hillside where the gravediggers had once startled something with red eyes back in November of the year before. It is a small place. It always was. A river town of a few thousand souls, settled where two rivers meet, watched over by old hills and older stories. Whatever Point Pleasant saw that long, strange winter, whether it was a creature or a chorus of frightened minds, whether it was a tall bird out of season or something stranger that the world has no name for, the seeing changed the town. The seeing knit the people together in a way that ordinary days never could. They shared a secret. They shared a question. And shared questions are the deepest kind of bond a community can have. That is the quiet truth. Not that the Mothman was real or that it was not. The quiet truth is that the people of Point Pleasant lived through something together. They sat at the same kitchen tables and asked the same impossible questions. They watched the same skies. They listened for the same footsteps in the same dark. By the afternoon of December 15th, none of them knew yet that the day was about to mark them forever. They went about their errands. They warmed their hands. They watched the gray light of the short afternoon begin to fade. The river kept moving, slow and silver, under the long shadow of the bridge. just stand on the West Virginia bank of the Ohio River on a cold December night, sometime after the world has gone quiet. The grass under your boots is stiff with frost. Each blade snaps softly when you shift your weight. The air smells of river mud and wood smoke, and somewhere far behind you, a porch light flickers through bare sycamore branches. The river moves slow here. It always has, wide and dark, the color of wet slate, sliding south with a steady whisper that sounds almost like breathing. You can see the water only because the moon catches it in long silver ribbons, the way candlelight catches a polished knife. Across the river sits Ohio, a low line of trees and a few scattered yellow windows. Between you and that far shore, the night holds its breath. This is the place, right here, where the silver bridge once arched across the water like a sleeping animal made of cable and steel. You can almost feel the shape of it still. The old piers stood not far from your feet, sunk deep into the riverbed. Cars used to hum across that bridge at all hours, headlights swinging out over the water, tail lights blinking red as they slipped into Ohio. On winter nights, the steel would tick and groan in the cold, settling like an old house. Close your eyes for a second. Listen. The river never stops talking. It mumbles over hidden stones. It pulls at the roots of willows leaning out from the bank. Somewhere upstream, a piece of driftwood thumps softly against the shore, then drifts on. An owl calls once from the woods behind you, a single low note that seems to roll across the water and come back changed. A train whistle moans far away, miles off, thin as a thread. Above you, the sky is enormous. Tonight it is the kind of clear that only happens in deep winter, when the cold scrubs the haze away. The stars sit close and bright. You can pick out the long sweep of the Milky Way, a faint white river running across the black, a mirror of the Ohio at your feet. Two rivers, one of water and one of light, and you standing small between them. The town of Point Pleasant sleeps behind you. Brick storefronts, tin roofs, a church steeple silvered by moonlight, smoke curling from chimneys in thin gray lines that bend east with the wind. Christmas lights wink on a few houses, red and green and gold, the colors blurred soft by the cold air. A dog barks somewhere down Main Street, then thinks better of it and goes quiet. The whole town feels like a held breath, a place between one thing and the next. The TNT area lies miles to the north, hidden by ridges and pine. You cannot see it from here, but you can feel it the way you feel a thunderstorm before it arrives. The concrete igloos sit out there in the dark, half buried under vines, full of nothing but echo and bad wings. The ponds reflect the same stars you see now. If the red-eyed shape is real, if it ever was real, it is out there too, perched somewhere high in the bones of an old steel frame, watching this same river with eyes that do not need the moon. A breeze moves down the valley. It carries the smell of cold iron from the railroad tracks and the faint, sweet rot of fallen leaves. Your breath rises in pale clouds and drifts away. Your fingers tingle inside your coat pockets. There is no fear in this dark. There is only the size of it, the weight of the sky pressing gently on your shoulders, the patience of the water, the slow turning of the world. It is easy, standing here, to understand why people in Point Pleasant told the stories they told. The land itself feels listening. The hills hold sound the way cupped hands hold water. The river carries every whisper downstream and never gives it back. In a place like this, a strange shape on a back road becomes part of the country. It belongs to the geography. It belongs to the long memory of two rivers meeting and pulling each other south. Stand a moment longer. Let the cold settle into your coat. Let the stars do their slow work overhead. The town behind you does not know yet what tomorrow night will bring. The bridge still hums in the dark, faithful as a heartbeat. The Ohio keeps moving, gentle and dark and old. This is the night the story belongs to. Hold it lightly. The river is doing the rest. The morning after the bridge fell, a strange quiet settled over Point Pleasant. It was the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against the windows and pools in the corners of empty rooms. The river still moved. The cold still came down off the hills in slow gray sheets. But something the town had carried for 13 months, something humming just under the skin of every street and porch, had gone still. The red eyes did not return. week, not that month, not ever really in the way they had come before. People noticed it before they spoke of it. A farmer would step out at dusk to feed his cattle and stand for a long moment, listening. The cornfields beyond his barn looked the same as always, the dry stalks rattling like paper bones in the wind. But the feeling was gone. That low electric hum, that prickle at the back of the neck, the sense of being watched from somewhere just past the tree line. All of it had lifted, as if a great gray sheet had been pulled away. In town, the windows of the old shops on Main Street glowed with their usual yellow lamps. The diner still served coffee in heavy white cups. The men still gathered there in the mornings, their boots stamping snow onto the tile floor. But the talk had changed. For months, the Mothman had been the second conversation in every room. The topic that rose up the moment the first round of small talk ended. Now, nobody wanted to say his name out loud. It felt, some folks said later, like the town had walked through a fever and come out the other side, blinking in the cold light, unsure of what had been real. The TNT area returned to its old loneliness. The concrete igloos sat humped in the snow like sleeping animals, the rusted doors frozen shut. The teenagers still drove out there on weekend nights, headlights bouncing through the bare trees, but the daring of it had soured. Nobody wanted to find anything anymore. They wanted only to drive past fast and tell the story later in a warm kitchen. Mary Hyre kept writing, though her notebook grew thinner. The phone calls slowed. The strangers in dark suits, if they had ever truly been strangers in dark suits, stopped knocking on doors. John Keel went home to New York with boxes of notes and a head full of questions. He would spend the rest of his life trying to arrange into some kind of order. The town did not follow him. The town stayed put, the way towns do, and tried to remember how to be ordinary. But ordinary never quite came back. Something had happened here, and everybody knew it, and that knowing slid down into the bones of the place and stayed. Children grew up hearing the story at kitchen tables. Grandfathers told it slow, in the long way old men tell things, with pauses for the kettle and the dog, and the sound of rain on the roof. Grandmothers told it with their hands folded eyes on the window. The way you tell a thing you half believe and half do not. The story bent and stretched and softened around the edges, the way all stories do when they pass from one set of lips to another. By the time the children of 1967 had children of their own, the Mothman had become a kind of family inheritance. Not a fright, not a warning, just a piece of who they were. Something you knew if you came from this stretch of river. Something outsiders would never quite understand, no matter how many books they read. The town began, slowly, to wear the legend the way an old coat is worn. A mural appeared on a downtown wall. A small museum opened in a narrow storefront, its windows full of yellowed newspaper clippings and grainy photographs and hand-drawn maps of the TNT area. A statue would come later, tall and silver and strange, with wings spread wide and eyes that caught the streetlight after dark. A festival would come too, every September, drawing people from across the country to walk the same sidewalks the Scarberrys had once driven past in a panic. What grew from the mystery was not fear. It was identity, a way of looking at the world that the people of Point Pleasant share without having to explain. They know that the impossible visited their town for a winter. They know it left when the bridge fell, and they know that some questions are not meant to be answered, only carried, the way a river carries the things that fall into it, down through the years, down toward whatever sea waits at the end. Long after the bridge fell and the news trucks left, the story of the red-eyed thing slipped quietly out of West Virginia. It traveled in the suitcases of people who needed to start over. It rode in the back seats of cars heading west on Route 35. One of those people was a man named Linda's brother, a quiet welder named Tommy Mallette, a cousin of Roger, the same Roger who had been in that car on the first November night. Tommy moved to Ohio first, then to Indiana, then all the way out to a flat little town in Kansas, where the wheat stretched to the edge of the sky. He took a job at a grain elevator. He kept his head down. He learned to like the wide, blank land where you could see weather coming from 40 miles away. Folks said he was friendly enough, but private. He never sat with his back to a window. In the evenings, after the elevator closed, Tommy would walk the dirt road that ran past his rented house. The Kansas dusk was different from the West Virginia dusk. There were no hills to swallow the sun. The light just thinned out across the prairie like watered milk. Crickets began their slow tuning. A barn owl sometimes drifted across the road on silent wings, pale as a bedsheet. That barn owl was the heart of the trouble. Wildlife biologists in the years after the sightings said that was the answer all along. A barn owl has a flat, heart-shaped face. Its eyes reflect red in a flashlight beam. It can stand nearly 2 feet tall, and when it spreads its wings, it looks impossibly wide. Add a sandhill crane to the mix, with its 7-foot wingspan and its strange red crown, and you had a tidy explanation. The folks of Point Pleasant, the biologists said, had simply seen birds. Tommy heard this theory plenty over the years. People in Kansas would ask, once they learned where he was from, if he had ever seen the Mothman himself. He always shook his head. He told them what his cousin Roger had told him. And then he would listen patiently as the listener offered the bird explanation like a kindness, like handing him a coat in cold weather. Tommy was not an angry man. He would smile and nod. Then he would say, gentle as a hymn, that he had grown up with barn owls. He had seen sandhill cranes too, lifting off the Ohio sandbars in autumn. None of them stood 7 feet tall on 2 human legs. None of them paced a person down a country road at 100 miles an hour. None of them folded their wings against their back like a coat and looked at you with eyes the color of stoplights. Out on the Kansas prairie, Tommy began to tell the story to anyone who asked. He told it the same way every time, with the same pauses, the same soft cadence. The grain elevator boys learned it by heart. Children at the church picnic learned it. By the time Tommy was an old man, the story of the Point Pleasant creature was being repeated in a Kansas town 1,000 miles from the Ohio River. It had changed a little in transit. In Kansas, the creature sometimes appeared above the wheat instead of the cornfields. The red eyes still watched, but now they watched from grain silos. The silver bridge was still in the story because Tommy never let that part go. He said that was the part that mattered. The thing had not been a monster. It had been a warning. This is what the bird theory could never quite hold. A barn owl does not warn a town. A sandhill crane does not show up before a tragedy and vanish after. The pattern was the problem. The timing was the problem. 13 months of sightings, ending the same week 46 people died, and then a silence that fell like a curtain. No biologist had a graph for that. Tommy died in Kansas in the late 90s. His grandchildren scattered to Denver, to St. Louis, to a small college town in Oregon. Each of them carries some version of the story. Each version is a little different. In Oregon, the creature stands in a fir forest. In Denver, it watches from a ridge above the highway. In St. Louis, it perches near the great brown river that drinks the Ohio whole. The legend has gone wandering the way legends do. It puts on new clothes and learns new accents. It finds new bridges to stand near. And every place it lands, somebody hears it and thinks quietly that no bird ever moved like that. Walk into Point Pleasant today, and you might not notice anything strange at first. The streets look like 100 other small American towns. There is a courthouse with white columns and a clock that keeps fair time. There are diners with red booths and coffee that tastes like coffee should. The Ohio River still slides past the edge of town, slow and brown, carrying leaves and light toward distant cities. But walk a little further, cross Main Street, and turn the corner near 4th. There, standing in a small plaza of brick and stone, you will find him. The statue is about 12 feet tall, made of polished steel that catches the sun like wet metal. He stands on 2 thin legs, his wings spread wide behind him, his chest pushed forward like a creature ready to leap into the sky, and his eyes are 2 round red discs set into a faceless head staring out at the street. Children pose beside him. Tourists hold up phones. Old men in ball caps walk past and tip their brims, half joking, half not. The statue went up in 2003, sculpted by an artist named Bob Roach. It is the only monument of its kind in the country. A town that built a shrine to the thing that haunted it. Across the street sits the Mothman Museum. The building is narrow and old, with big windows and red letters above the door. Inside, the air smells like old paper and floor wax. Glass cases hold yellowed newspapers from 1966, their headlines fading but still readable. There are props from the movie that brought the story to Hollywood. There are hand-drawn maps of every sighting, dotted across the county like stars in a dark sky. There are letters from witnesses, some written decades after the fact, the handwriting shaky but sure. Every September, the town holds the Mothman Festival. For 2 days, the streets fill with people from every corner of the country. They wear wings made of black felt. They paint their faces. They wait in long lines for funnel cakes and for a chance to walk through the TNT area with a guide who knows where the old igloos still stand. Bands play on outdoor stages. Vendors sell t-shirts and patches and tiny figurines with glowing red eyes. The festival started small, just a few hundred people. Now it draws more than 10,000. Some folks in Point Pleasant rolled their eyes at first. They thought the town was making a circus out of something dark. They remembered the Silver Bridge. They remembered the families who lost mothers and fathers and children in the cold water. They worried that turning the legend into a party would somehow disrespect the dead. But others saw it differently. They said the festival was not a celebration of the creature. It was a way to keep the story alive without letting it sour into grief. It was a way to bring strangers into town, to share the mystery, to put Point Pleasant back on the map for something other than tragedy. The diners stay full. The hotels book up months in advance. The streets hum with life in a way they had not hummed in years. And the question stays open. That is the strange gift of this story. After all the books and the films and the documentaries and the late-night radio shows, nobody has solved it. The barn owl theory still has its defenders. The sandhill crane theory has its own. The folklore scholars still write papers about how mass belief can shape a town's memory. The believers still drive out to the TNT area on cold November nights, hoping to see two red eyes drift up out of the dark. None of them have the final word. Not the scientists, not the skeptics, not even John Keel, who wrote the book that made the legend famous and who died in 2009, still saying he did not know what the creature was. The statue stands on its plaza. The river slides past the edge of town. The igloos sit half buried in the woods, their concrete walls cracked and patient. And every year, more people come. They come because they want to stand where the Scarberrys stood. They want to look up at the place where the bridge used to be. They want to feel, for one moment, that the world is stranger than they were told. Point Pleasant remembers. The town has decided that some mysteries are worth keeping. Some stories are better left with their doors a little open, so that the wind can still move through them, carrying whatever it carries, on its way to somewhere none of us can name. And so we come back slowly to the quiet place where this whole story began. Point Pleasant sleeps tonight, just as it slept long before anyone spoke the name Mothman. The two rivers still meet at the point, the Ohio bending one way and the Kanawha bending the other, their dark waters folding together like two hands clasped in the cold. A thin mist drifts above the surface. The street lamps glow soft and orange along Main Street, casting long shadows over brick walls that have stood for 100 winters. The statue stands in the little plaza, polished metal catching the moonlight. Its wings are spread wide, its eyes round and steady. Snow gathers on its shoulders some nights, and rain washes it clean again on others. People walk past in the morning carrying coffee, and they nod at it the way you might nod at an old neighbor. It belongs here now. It has earned its place. Out past the edge of town, the TNT area sits the way it always has. The concrete igloos rise from the earth like the backs of sleeping animals, half swallowed by vines and soft moss. The forest has grown thick around them. Deer move through the grass on quiet hooves. An owl calls once, low and round, and the sound rolls out across the hills before fading into nothing. The North Power plant is gone now, mostly. What remains is rust and rebar and broken brick, slowly returning to the soil. The wind moves through the empty rooms the way wind moves through any forgotten place. There is no menace in it. There is only time working patiently, the way time always works. Down at the river, the new bridge stands strong, Its lights blink steady and red against the night sky, mirrored in the slow black water below. Trucks rumble across it without a thought. The cold air carries the smell of wet stone and river silt, of pine sap and wood smoke from chimneys far back in the hills. Somewhere a dog barks once, then settles. A train whistle moans far off, lonesome and beautiful. The way train whistles have moaned in this valley for 150 years. This is the real ending, if a story like this can ever truly end. The legend lives in the soft hours, in the quiet talk of people who grew up here. It lives in the festival each September, when the streets fill with laughter and lanterns. It lives in the books and the films and the strangers who drive long miles just to stand beside the statue and wonder. It lives because people keep telling it, and a story told is a story still breathing. Maybe what those young people saw on Route 62 was a great bird, lost and far from home, its eyes burning red in the headlights. Maybe it was something stranger, something the old maps never named, something the Shawnee knew about long before the powder plant was ever built. Maybe it was grief wearing a shape, a warning the town could feel before it could understand. Maybe it was all of these things woven together by memory